Taehyung reveals Jungkook's secret plan to marry and move to America next year on a live podcast. Jungkook's reaction? Total panic and blushing chaos. Wait. Should I say it? Should I really tell them? Taehyung's voice crackled through the studio microphones, his eyes sparkling with mischief. The neon lights of the podcast studio flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows over the polished black table that separated him from Jungkook. 1,000 live viewers flooded the chat with emojis, question marks, and wild speculation as Taehyung leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms as if savoring the anticipation. Jungkook, who had been casually sipping his iced Americano, almost choked at Taehyung's question. He coughed, eyes wide, glancing nervously at the camera before glaring at his Hyung. "Yeah, what are you talking about?" Jungkook's voice was sharp, tinged with panic, but his cheeks already betrayed him, blooming crimson under the relentless gaze of the studio lights. Taehyung only grinned wider, tapping his fingers rhythmically on the desk, his expression somewhere between innocent and devious. "Oh, come on. Don't pretend you don't know. You know exactly what I'm talking about," he teased, winking at the camera. The chat exploded, wild guesses, exclamations, and fan theories spilling out in real time. Jungkook's jaw clenched. He rubbed his palms together nervously, eyes darting to the camera and back to Taehyung. His tongue flicked out to wet his lips. "Hyung, you promised," he whispered, voice low and strained, meant only for Taehyung's ears, but the microphone caught it, amplifying the anxiety that dripped from every syllable. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying every second of Jungkook's torment. "Ah, did I? I don't remember," he mused, shrugging his shoulders dramatically. Then, with the flair of someone about to drop the juiciest gossip of the century, he leaned forward, eyes locked onto the camera as if addressing every single person watching directly. "Well, it's not really a big deal. Just that Jungkook is planning to get married and move to America next year," Taehyung declared, his voice echoing in the soundproof room, punctuated by a gasp from the sound engineer in the corner. For a split second, the studio was silent. Even the live chat seemed to freeze, caught in disbelief, suspended in that single electrifying moment. Jungkook's eyes went wide, his mouth dropping open as if his brain couldn't process what had just been unleashed. "What?" he shouted, hands slamming on the desk. The iced coffee tipped over, spilling dark liquid across the table, seeping into the cracks and pooling near the edges. He scrambled to right it, his hands shaking. "Hyung, what the hell are you talking about?" His voice pitched higher, betraying the thin layer of calm he tried desperately to maintain. Taehyung burst into laughter, clutching his sides as Jungkook fumbled with tissues, attempting to mop up the mess. "Oh, come on. Don't act so surprised. You thought you could hide it forever? The secret's out now, buddy." He leaned back with a triumphant grin, crossing his arms as if he had just won a bet with fate itself. The chat was a storm now, comments blurring into a continuous stream of disbelief, joy, and heartbreak from fans who were processing the bombshell revelation in real time. Hearts, crying emojis, and mind-blown icons flooded the screen. The numbers on the live view counter ticked up rapidly, thousands more joining by the second. Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Hyung," he started, voice strained and edged with genuine panic. "That was supposed to be private," he hissed, his gaze flickering nervously to the camera and back. His ears were flushed pink, the tips burning visibly under the lights. Taehyung shrugged again, not the slightest bit remorseful. "I just sped up the timeline a little. It's not like you weren't gonna tell them eventually, right?" He grinned, patting Jungkook's shoulder with mock sympathy. "You're welcome." Jungkook groaned, sinking back into his chair as if the weight of the entire universe had just collapsed onto his chest. He rubbed his temples, breathing deeply to calm the rush of adrenaline that had his hands shaking. "I can't believe you just did that," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Taehyung's smile softened just a touch, eyes glimmering with sincerity behind the teasing facade. "Hey, at least now you don't have to hide it. Aren't you tired of keeping secrets, Kookie?" he asked gently, voice dropping to a whisper. Jungkook's gaze faltered, the mask slipping for just a second as something deep and unspoken flickered in his eyes. He took a shaky breath, meeting Taehyung's gaze head-on. "Yeah, maybe I am," he admitted softly. But then, with a flash of his usual defiance, he straightened up, eyes hardening once more. "But I still can't believe you did that, Liv." Taehyung laughed, full and unapologetic, his joy infectious. "Hey, it's a podcast. If you're gonna drop a bomb, might as well do it right," he replied, eyes twinkling with unrepentant glee. Jungkook groaned, hiding his face in his hands as the camera zoomed in for dramatic effect. "I'm never letting you near a microphone again," he muttered through his palms, voice muffled but unmistakably genuine. Outside the glass walls of the studio, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows with rhythmic persistence. But inside, the chaos had only just begun. The silence in the studio was deafening. Outside, the rain splattered against the glass like tiny bullets, blurring the neon lights of the city beyond. Inside, the chaos had only just begun. The chat exploded with a frenzy of messages. Questions, disbelief, declarations of heartbreak and excitement. Is it true? Who is she? When did this happen? America? Seriously? The rapid-fire comments scrolled faster than any human could read, the numbers climbing with every passing second. Jungkook's eyes were still wide with shock, his fingers frozen halfway to his mouth as if he had been caught mid-thought. His breath came in shallow bursts, the rush of adrenaline making his hands tremble slightly. Taehyung, still leaning back with that signature smug grin, watched him with eyes glimmering with mischief and something deeper. Something almost protective, though it was buried beneath layers of playful arrogance. "Hyung, what the hell was that?" Jungkook's voice was strained, barely above a whisper, but the microphone picked up every shaky syllable. He leaned forward, eyes locking onto Taehyung's with an intensity that could have shattered glass. "How could you just drop that like it's nothing?" Taehyung shrugged, crossing his legs comfortably, as if they were in a coffee shop gossiping about weekend plans instead of live in front of millions. "I thought it was time, and honestly you should thank me. Now you don't have to keep pretending," he said smoothly, his voice low and velvety. "Thank you." Jungkook's laugh was sharp and humorless, spilling out before he could stop it. He rubbed his temples, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on him physically. "You think I should thank you? Hyung, you just dropped my entire life on the internet like it's some big secret?" Taehyung interrupted, his smile softening but not fading. "Come on, Kookie. Everyone's gonna find out eventually. Better to do it with style." Jungkook shot him a glare so fierce that the laughter drained from Taehyung's eyes, replaced with something harder, more reflective. Jungkook leaned forward, voice dropping to a hiss that only Taehyung could hear. "That wasn't your secret to tell," he whispered fiercely, his fists clenched on the table, knuckles whitening. Taehyung's grin faded, replaced by a flash of regret, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe not," he admitted, his voice softer, almost apologetic. "But you were never gonna say it yourself, were you? You were just gonna keep pretending everything's the same when it's not." Jungkook's hands fell to his lap, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He stared down at his hands, fingers twisting together restlessly. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I was going to tell them, just not like this," he murmured almost to himself. The studio door creaked open, and the producer poked his head inside, his expression caught between shock and professionalism. We're still live," he said hesitantly, eyes flicking between the two of them. "Do you want me to cut the feed?" Before Jungkook could answer, Taehyung shook his head. "No, leave it. We're just getting started," he said smoothly, flashing the producer a grin that sent the man scurrying back out the door, leaving it slightly ajar. Jungkook's eyes flickered up, surprise mingling with disbelief. "Just getting started? Are you serious right now?" Taehyung leaned forward, his elbows on the table, hands clasped together like he was about to deliver a sermon. Look, they deserve to know, right? Isn't that why we do this? To be real? To be honest with them? Jungkook's jaw clenched. His eyes flashed with something raw and vulnerable before he looked away, fingers gripping the edge of the table like it might anchor him to reality. Honest? You think this is honest? Dropping my life without asking? Without even... God! Hyung, you don't even know the whole story, he said, voice cracking on the last word. Taehyung's smile faltered, just a hairline fracture in his confidence. He leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. Then tell me, he challenged, voice low. Tell all of us. Isn't it time? The room fell silent again, the only sound the rhythmic tap of rain against the glass. Jungkook stared at the microphone, its tiny red light blinking steadily back at him, waiting. He swallowed hard, the tension in his shoulders visible even through the thick fabric of his hoodie. For a long moment, he didn't speak, the weight of expectation heavy in the air. Then he exhaled, long and slow, and raised his eyes to meet Taehyung's. Fine, he said, voice firmer now, almost defiant. You want the truth? Here it is. He adjusted the microphone, leaning in closer so his voice would be clear, unmistakable. Yes, I'm getting married. Yes, I'm moving to America. But it's not what you think. Taehyung blinked, the surprise flashing across his face for the briefest moment before he regained his composure. What do you mean it's not what we think? He asked, his voice softer, almost hesitant. Jungkook's eyes darkened, a shadow passing through them that Taehyung recognized immediately. The kind of pain that isn't easily shaken off, that clings to the bones long after the wounds have healed. You think this is some happy little plan? Jungkook laughed, but there was no joy in it. It was sharp, brittle. You think I just woke up one day and decided, hey, I'm gonna leave everything behind and start over across the world? It's not that simple. Taehyung's hands unclasped, fingers splayed across the table. Then tell me, he urged, his voice softer, leaning in. Tell me why, Kooky. Jungkook's eyes flickered with hesitation, 1,000 emotions warring for dominance in the space of a heartbeat. His fingers curled tighter around the edge of the desk, and he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Because I have to, he said finally, voice cracking with the force of it. I don't have a choice. The room was so silent that even the rain seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation. Taehyung's expression softened, his eyes searching Jungkook's face for answers that weren't yet given. Why? He whispered, voice barely audible. Jungkook swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to his hands, as if the words he was about to speak were carved into his palms. There are things you don't know, things I can't talk about. Not yet, he said, his voice trembling just enough to betray the fragility of his composure. He looked up, his eyes glimmering with unshed tears. But when I do, when I finally tell you, you'll understand. Taehyung sat back, the playful mask gone, replaced by something deeper, older. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Jungkook's. I'm holding you to that, he said, voice steady and unyielding. Jungkook nodded, his hands releasing their grip on the table as he exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. I know, he whispered back, almost inaudible. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, streaking the glass with silver ribbons, distorting the lights of the city into shimmering pools of color. Inside, the silence stretched, heavy with the weight of secrets yet to be spoken, promises yet to be kept. The camera light blinked steadily, recording every flicker of emotion, every glance, every whispered word. And somewhere in the swirling storm of live comments, one message appeared over and over again, filling the chat with a single demand. We want the truth. But as Jungkook looked up, eyes meeting the camera with newfound resolve, it was clear to everyone watching. The truth was just the beginning. The rain pounded harder against the studio windows, streaking the glass with shimmering trails of water that fractured the neon lights outside into jagged patterns. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that crackles right before a storm breaks. Jungkook sat in his chair, his fingers still trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the blinking red light of the camera, as if it held the answers to questions he hadn't even asked yet. Taehyung watched him silently for a moment, the silence stretching taut between them, vibrating with unspoken tension. Finally, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped under his chin. "You said it's not what we think," he began, voice low and steady, almost coaxing. "So tell us what it really is." Jungkook's eyes flickered with hesitation, but there was something else there too, defiance. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms protectively over his chest as if bracing himself. "You really want to do this now?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual, slicing through the tension like a blade. Taehyung didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unyielding. "We're already here, aren't we? Might as well go all the way," he replied smoothly, a hint of challenge lacing his words. Jungkook's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the camera, the numbers of live viewers ticking upward by the second, a sea of digital faces waiting for his confession. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his thoughts, then opened them with renewed resolve. "Fine," he said, his voice steady but edged with something sharp. "You want the truth? Here it is." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes boring into Taehyung's with a fire that hadn't been there before. "I'm moving to America because I don't have a choice," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. "It's not about love, it's not some fairy tale ending. It's business, it's politics, it's control." Taehyung blinked, taken aback. "Politics? What are you talking about?" Jungkook chuckled bitterly, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "You think the world we live in is simple? That it's just about music and dancing and smiling for the camera? It's not." He spat out, voice dripping with something dark and jagged. "There are deals, contracts, expectations. I'm moving because I have to, because I signed away my freedom a long time ago." Taehyung stared at him, expression unreadable. "You're saying this isn't your choice?" he asked carefully, voice softer now, almost gentle. Jungkook's eyes flashed, a spark of fury igniting behind them. "Of course it's not my choice," he shouted, his fist slamming down onto the table with a force that made the microphones shake. "Do you think I'd choose this? To leave everything? Everyone I care about? Do you think I want that?" The chat went wild, comments flooding in faster than the server could handle. The producer peeked nervously through the studio window, his hands gesturing wildly to cut to a commercial. But Taehyung shook his head subtly, never breaking eye contact with Jungkook. "Then why don't you just say no?" Taehyung pressed, his voice unwavering despite the storm raging in Jungkook's eyes. Jungkook laughed again, but it was hollow, empty. "You don't get it. You can't just say no to them. Not when you've signed everything away. Not when you owe them your life." He leaned back, crossing his arms defensively. "I'm leaving because I have to, because I made a promise I can't break." Taehyung's brow furrowed, concern etching lines into his normally smooth expression. "A promise to who?" Jungkook hesitated, the tension rippling through his shoulders like the aftershock of an earthquake. His eyes darted away, glancing at the rain-splattered windows before settling back on Taehyung. "To her," he whispered finally, the words barely more than a breath. The room fell silent, the rain drumming against the glass the only sound. Taehyung leaned forward, his eyes searching Jungkook's for answers. "Her? Who's her?" Jungkook swallowed hard, his fingers tapping restlessly against the polished wood of the table. "I can't say," he murmured, his voice cracking slightly. "But I owe her everything." Taehyung's eyes softened, his voice dropping to a whisper. Is it really that bad? That you have to leave everything behind?" Jungkook's gaze snapped back to him, fire burning bright in his eyes. "You don't understand, Taehyung," he said sharply. If I don't keep my word, people get hurt." His voice dropped, eyes flickering with shadows of memories unsaid. "Not just me." The rain intensified, slamming against the glass like 1,000 tiny fists. Thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, low and menacing. Outside, the city lights flickered, dimming for just a moment before blazing back to life. Taehyung took a deep breath, leaning back in his chair as if absorbing the weight of what Jungkook had just confessed. So, you're doing this for her? For this person you can't even name? Jungkook nodded slowly, his expression grim. Yeah, he replied simply, voice raw with emotion. For her. Taehyung looked down at his hands, fingers lacing together thoughtfully. When he looked back up, his eyes were sharper, filled with determination. Then why the hell haven't you told me before? He demanded, voice rising. We've been through everything together, Jungkook. Everything. And you keep this from me. Jungkook's expression softened, guilt flickering in his eyes. I was trying to protect you, he murmured, voice cracking slightly. The less you know, the safer you are. Taehyung shook his head slowly, disbelief etched into every line of his face. You think I care about that? You think I care about safety when you're out here dealing with whatever this is? Jesus, Jungkook. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. I would have stood by you, no matter what. You know that, right? Jungkook's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his hands gripping the edge of the table, so tightly his knuckles turned white. I know, he whispered, his voice breaking. I know, Hyung, but this is different. Taehyung leaned forward, his eyes blazing with determination. Then let me help you, he said firmly. You don't have to do this alone. We'll figure it out. We always do. Jungkook shook his head slowly, a sad smile pulling at the corners of his lips. Not this time, he murmured. This time, it's just me. The rain hammered against the glass harder than ever, the storm raging outside reflecting the turmoil inside. The chat was a flurry of chaos, emojis of heartbreak, questions of who she was, demands for the truth. But inside the room, it was just the two of them, the air thick with secrets and promises unspoken. Taehyung's eyes never left Jungkook's, the silence stretching between them, heavy with the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. Outside, lightning split the sky in jagged streaks of white, illuminating the city in brief flashes of stark clarity. But inside, the storm had only just begun. The rain had not stopped. It poured relentlessly from the darkened sky, battering the studio windows with a ferocity that mirrored the tension lingering in the room. The city outside blurred behind streaks of water, lights shimmering like distant stars distorted by a galaxy of tears. Inside, the air hung heavy with silence, an oppressive, suffocating stillness that neither Jungkook nor Taehyung seemed willing to break. Taehyung's fingers drummed rhythmically against the surface of the polished table, the sound sharp and steady, a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Jungkook's gaze was fixed on his hands, eyes tracing the faint scars and calluses, remnants of years spent perfecting his craft. His expression was distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the rain-streaked glass of the studio. Finally, Taehyung broke the silence, his voice soft but unyielding. Who is she, Jungkook? The question hung in the air, lingering like smoke, curling and thickening with each passing second of silence. Jungkook's jaw clenched, his fingers flexing instinctively, but he didn't look up. Taehyung leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unrelenting. You said you're leaving for her. You said it's not what we think. So tell me, who is she? And why the hell are you sacrificing everything for her? His voice grew sharper, frustration seeping into each word. I deserve to know. After all this time, don't I deserve that? Jungkook's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a raw, unguarded emotion. Deserve? He repeated, voice low and taut. You think this is about what you deserve? He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the polished floor with a grating shriek. This is bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than any of this. His hand gestured wildly around the room, eyes flicking to the camera still blinking with its crimson eye, watching, recording. Taehyung's gaze didn't waver. Bigger than us? He echoed, voice edged with disbelief. You think I wouldn't understand? You think I wouldn't stand by you? His eyes softened, the sharp edges of his expression smoothing into something more vulnerable. I've always stood by you. Always. Jungkook's hands fell to his sides, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. His breath came in shallow bursts, his chest heaving with the effort to hold it all in. You don't understand, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own words. If I tell you, if you know, everything changes. Taehyung stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. His eyes bored into Jungkook's, unwavering and fierce. Then let it change, he replied, voice steady and resolute. I'm not afraid of the truth, Jungkook. I never have been. He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. Tell me everything. Jungkook stared back at him, his eyes reflecting something fragile, something that trembled beneath the surface. He swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working against the knot that had lodged itself there. If I tell you, there's no going back, he murmured, voice soft and broken. You have to understand that. Once you know, you're part of it too. Taehyung's expression softened, his eyes glimmering with determination. I've always been part of it, he whispered. From the beginning. He took another step forward, his hand reaching out to grip Jungkook's shoulder firmly. I'm with you, no matter what. Jungkook's eyes fell shut, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the admission he had held for far too long. When he opened his eyes again, there was a fire there, a flicker of resolve, of acceptance. He inhaled deeply, his breath shaky but determined. Okay, he whispered, voice barely audible. Okay, I'll tell you. Taehyung's hand dropped back to his side, his expression hardening with focus. I'm listening, he said simply, his voice steady. Jungkook took a step back, his hands shaking slightly as he rubbed them together, the friction grounding him. He glanced towards the camera, the chat still scrolling wildly, fans speculating, guessing, grasping at fragments of information with wild abandon. He hesitated, then turned back to Taehyung. Not here, he whispered, voice low and strained. Not like this. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, glancing at the blinking camera light before nodding in understanding. He stepped back to his chair, pulling his microphone closer. All right, everyone, he began smoothly, the charisma of a performer slipping effortlessly back into place. I think we've given you enough drama for one night. We're gonna end the live here. But don't worry, we'll be back soon. With more clarity. He shot a look at Jungkook, whose expression remained tense and guarded. The live feed cut out, the screen going dark as the producer's voice crackled through the intercom. That was intense, he murmured, the tension in his voice palpable. Are you guys good? Should I? We're fine. Taehyung interrupted firmly, waving off the concern. His eyes never left Jungkook's, even as the studio lights dimmed slightly, the artificial glare easing into something softer. You ready? He asked, his voice softer now, stripped of its bravado. Jungkook nodded, his eyes flickering with something unnameable. Let's go, he replied, voice taut. They walked out of the studio in silence, the rain still hammering against the pavement outside. Taehyung pulled his hood up, hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, while Jungkook simply let the rain soak him, his hair plastered to his forehead, droplets trailing down his cheeks like phantom tears. They walked in silence, the city humming around them, the lights of passing cars splashing reflections against the wet asphalt. Finally, Taehyung broke the silence. Where are we going? He asked, voice muffled by the rain. Jungkook hesitated, his eyes scanning the rain-slicked streets before turning to Taehyung. Somewhere safe, he replied cryptically, his voice edged with tension. He led them through winding back streets, the neon glow of the city fading into shadows, the noise dimming into a hushed whisper. They finally stopped in front of a narrow building tucked between two towering apartment complexes, its entrance barely visible from the street. Jungkook reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn key, its edges dulled with use. He slid it into the lock, the door creaking open with a groan that seemed to echo down the empty alley. Inside, the air was thick with dust and nostalgia. Old posters hung on the walls, faded and peeling at the corners, and the scent of stale air and forgotten memories clung to the shadows. Jungkook led the way, his footsteps sure and steady, guiding Taehyung through a maze of narrow hallways and creaking stairs. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred with years of use. Jungkook turned to Taehyung, his expression guarded but resolute. "This is it," he murmured. Taehyung nodded silently, his eyes sharp and unwavering. Jungkook pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small room, barely furnished. A single desk cluttered with papers, a bookshelf lined with thick binders, and a chair draped with a worn leather jacket. The walls were lined with photographs, maps, and scribbled notes that stretched from floor to ceiling. Taehyung stepped inside, his eyes widening as he took it all in. What is all this?" he whispered, voice laced with awe and confusion. Jungkook closed the door behind them, the lock clicking shut with finality. He turned to Taehyung, his expression steeled with determination. "This," he began, his voice steady and unwavering, "is the truth." And as the rain continued to fall outside, battering the windows with relentless persistence, the two stood in silence, the weight of what was to come settling over them like a shadow that could not be outrun. The air inside the room was thick with the scent of dust and old paper, mingling with the faint metallic tang of rain seeping through the cracks in the window frame. Shadows stretched long across the cluttered space, cast by the single bulb that flickered ominously from the ceiling. Taehyung stood frozen just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping over the walls plastered with maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs. Some old and yellowed with age, others startlingly recent. He took a hesitant step forward, his shoes creaking against the wooden floorboards that groaned under the weight of secrets long kept. Jungkook closed the door behind them with a firm click, the sound reverberating through the small space like the slamming of a vault. He leaned back against it for a moment, his eyes heavy with fatigue and something darker, something edged with resignation. "I never wanted you to see this," he said finally, his voice rough and edged with vulnerability. "But there's no turning back now." Taehyung turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Jungkook's with an intensity that could have cracked glass. "You brought me here," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes blazing. "You wanted me to know. So tell me, Jungkook. Tell me everything." Jungkook swallowed hard, his hands flexing at his sides as if testing their strength. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of it, before he pushed off from the door and moved to the cluttered desk in the center of the room. His fingers traced the edge of the wood, brushing past stacks of paper and files marked with thick, bold letters. Confidential, classified, restricted access. He picked up a photograph, staring at it for a long moment before turning it around to face Taehyung. It was a woman, her hair flowing dark and smooth, eyes sharp and clear with determination. She was beautiful, almost ethereal, but there was a hardness in her gaze that spoke of struggle and survival. Taehyung stepped forward, his fingers brushing the corner of the photo as he examined it. "Who is she?" he asked softly, eyes never leaving the image. Jungkook's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with something raw and unguarded. "Her name is Minji," he replied, his voice low and steady. "She's the reason I'm leaving." Taehyung's gaze snapped back to Jungkook, disbelief flaring in his eyes. "The reason you're leaving? Jungkook, you're throwing everything away for her." His voice cracked slightly, disbelief cracking through his usual confidence. "What the hell is going on?" Jungkook didn't flinch. He simply walked over to the wall, his fingers brushing across a map dotted with red pins, each one connected by strings of yarn that stretched across countries and cities like veins. His fingers stopped at one particular pin, pressed deeply into the map over a city in California. "It's not just for her," he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's for what she knows, for what she's been running from." Taehyung frowned, stepping closer, his eyes darting over the intricate connections spread across the map. Running? From who? His voice was sharp now, edged with urgency. Jungkook's eyes were dark, shadowed with memories he hadn't shared. Not with Taehyung. Not with anyone. He exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. From them, he whispered, his eyes flickering up to meet Taehyung's gaze. From the people who don't want the truth to come out. Taehyung took a step back, his expression hardening with disbelief. The truth? What truth? Jungkook, this sounds like some kind of conspiracy theory. Are you seriously telling me you're running to America because of some girl and a map full of pins? His voice rose with every word, frustration spilling over like a dam bursting. Jungkook's eyes flashed with fire, his voice sharp as a blade. It's not just a map, he shouted, the sound reverberating through the room, making the walls feel smaller, the ceiling lower. It's everything. There's people disappearing. There's families torn apart. It's contracts signed in blood and secrets buried so deep, even I'm afraid to dig them up. He paused, chest heaving with the force of his words. His hands trembled slightly before he shoved them into his pockets, grounding himself. Minji found something she wasn't supposed to, he continued, his voice dropping back to a whisper. And now they want her gone. And me, I promised her I'd protect her. No matter what. Taehyung stared at him, eyes wide and unblinking. Who wants her gone, Jungkook? Who are you talking about? His voice was hushed now, almost reverent, like speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile truth that hung in the air. Jungkook hesitated, his fingers flexing unconsciously as if searching for strength. He moved to the bookshelf, pulling out a thick, leather-bound folder and tossing it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud, dust spiraling up into the light like tiny ghosts. This, he said, tapping his fingers on the cover, is everything Minji found. Names, dates, locations, people who aren't supposed to exist. Deals that never made it to the headlines. He looked up, his eyes blazing with conviction. They call themselves the network. Taehyung's brows knitted together, skepticism lining his features. The network? Jungkook, this is insane. What are you even saying? His voice shook slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Jungkook's eyes locked onto his, unwavering and cold. I'm saying, he began slowly, deliberately, that everything we've known, the contracts, the deals, the industry, it's all tied together, every single bit of it. And Minji, she was part of it, until she tried to get out. Taehyung's hand raked through his hair, his breathing shallow. You're saying this girl, Minji, she's being hunted by who? Shadow organizations? Government? What the hell are you talking about? His voice trembled, the disbelief cracking under the weight of the truth unfolding before him. Jungkook's expression softened for just a moment, a flicker of sorrow flashing across his eyes. I'm talking about power, he said simply. The kind that doesn't show up on news broadcasts or social media. The kind that decides who gets to succeed and who gets erased. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. They control everything, Taehyung. And Minji, she stole something from them. Something they want back. Taehyung stared at him, his eyes searching Jungkook's for any hint of deception. Any crack in the story that would make it all collapse back into reality. But there was none. Just cold, unyielding truth. What did she take? He whispered, barely audible. Jungkook's hands clenched into fists, his gaze hardening. Evidence, he replied, voice steel-edged and certain. Proof of everything. And they're coming for her. And for anyone who stands in their way. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, echoing through the room like the heartbeat of something alive and dangerous. Taehyung swallowed hard, his voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. So, you're running? He asked, voice laced with disbelief. You're just gonna leave everything behind to fight them? To protect her? Jungkook's eyes blazed with determination, his jaw set in grim defiance. I'm not running, he replied firmly. I'm fighting back. And in that moment, Taehyung knew there was no turning back. Not for either of them. The rain hadn't stopped. If anything, it seemed to grow stronger, battering against the windows with a fury that shook the glass. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the narrow room in stark, blinding bursts of white. Jungkook stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the flickering light, hands shoved deep into his pockets. His shoulders were tense, the lines of his back rigid as if bracing against the storm outside, and the one brewing inside. Taehyung sat slumped in the worn leather chair across the room, fingers laced together, elbows braced on his knees. His gaze was fixed on Jungkook, eyes sharp and unyielding. He hadn't moved for several minutes, hadn't spoken since the confession. Since Jungkook had laid it all bare. The network, Minji, the impossible choice that lay before him. Finally, Taehyung broke the silence, his voice low and steady. So that's it then? You're just, what? Gonna disappear? Run to America and hope that they don't find you? Hope they don't find her. His tone was edged with disbelief, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Jungkook's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. His voice came out softer than he intended, almost a whisper. It's not running, he murmured, his breath fogging up the glass as he spoke. It's surviving. Taehyung let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his hands clenching into fists. Surviving? He repeated, disbelief dripping from each syllable. Since when did you start surviving, Jungkook? You've never just survived. You fought. You clawed your way to the top. And now you're telling me you're just leaving? For some girl you never even mentioned before. His voice cracked on the last word, his chest heaving with frustration. Jungkook turned slowly, his eyes dark and unyielding. It's not just some girl, he replied, his voice firm and controlled. It's Minji. She's... He hesitated, the words catching in his throat, eyes flickering with a rawness Taehyung had never seen before. She's the only thing that makes sense anymore. Taehyung's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. The only thing that makes sense? He repeated, his voice rising. We built this, Jungkook, together. You're seriously gonna throw it all away for someone you kept secret? For something you never even bothered to tell me about? Jungkook flinched, the accusation hitting harder than he expected. He took a step forward, hands still jammed into his pockets as if anchoring himself. I didn't keep her secret, he said quietly. I kept her safe. His eyes flared with desperation, his voice cracking under the weight of his own confession. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to choose between you and her? Between this life and her safety? His fists clenched tighter, nails digging into his palms. I didn't have a choice, Taehyung. I never did. Taehyung stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His eyes blazed with fury, his hands shaking as they hung by his sides. That's bullshit, he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. You always have a choice. We could have figured this out together. You didn't have to lie. You didn't have to do this alone. His breathing was ragged, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched. Jungkook took a step back, his expression softening for just a moment. I did it because I knew you'd try to stop me, he whispered, voice broken. You wouldn't understand, and I couldn't risk it. Not with Minji's life on the line. Taehyung's eyes shimmered with something raw, something dangerously close to tears, but he blinked it away, his expression hardening. You don't get to decide what I understand, he shot back, voice shaking. You don't get to just walk away and expect me to accept it. You're not alone, Jungkook. You never were. And I'm not about to let you disappear without a fight. Jungkook shook his head slowly, sadness creasing his features. I'm not asking you to accept it, he murmured, voice heavy with resignation. I'm asking you to trust me. Just this once. Taehyung's laugh was sharp, brittle. Trust you? How am I supposed to trust you when you've been lying to me for God knows how long? How do I trust you when I don't even know who you are anymore? His voice cracked on the last word, splintering the tension that hung between them. Jungkook flinched as if struck, his eyes flickering with pain. He took another step forward, his hands leaving his pockets to reach out, fingers trembling. "I'm still me," he whispered, voice raw. "I'm still the same person I've always been. But this is something I have to do." Taehyung stared at him, his jaw clenching and unclenching, eyes shimmering with conflict. "I can't let you go alone," he whispered, voice barely audible. "I won't." Jungkook's eyes softened, a flicker of hope sparking in the darkness. "I don't want you to," he whispered back, voice cracking with emotion. "But it's dangerous, Taehyung. They're watching. They're always watching. If you're with me, you'll be a target too." Taehyung stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his hands coming up to grip Jungkook's shoulders tightly. "Then let them watch," he growled, voice steady and unyielding. "I'm not afraid of them. I'm not afraid of anything if it means standing by you." Jungkook's eyes shimmered with tears, his hands coming up to grip Taehyung's wrists. "You don't understand," he whispered, voice breaking. "They don't just watch. They erase people, memories, entire lives. If they find out you're with me, then I'll fight." Taehyung interrupted fiercely, his grip tightening. "I'm not letting you go through this alone. Not now. Not ever." Jungkook stared at him, shock and something dangerously close to hope flaring in his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying," he whispered. Taehyung's eyes hardened with resolve. "I know exactly what I'm saying," he replied, voice steady. "I'm saying I'm with you, until the end." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the rain pounding against the windows like 1,000 tiny fists. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the room in stark, blinding light. Jungkook exhaled shakily, his hands dropping from Taehyung's wrists. "Then we have to move," he murmured, voice trembling. "We don't have much time." Taehyung nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Where do we start?" Jungkook moved to the cluttered desk, yanking open a drawer and pulling out a thick folder marked with crimson ink. "Project K. Files confidential." He tossed it onto the desk, the papers scattering slightly from the impact. "We start with Minji," he said, voice firm. "We find her, and we end this." Taehyung stepped forward, eyes sharp and unyielding. "And if they find us first?" Jungkook's eyes darkened, his jaw setting with determination. "Then we fight," he replied simply, his voice steady and unyielding. "We fight until there's nothing left." Taehyung's hand reached out, gripping Jungkook's shoulder firmly. "Then let's go," he whispered, voice laced with fire. Jungkook nodded, eyes flickering with resolve. "Let's end this." The rain continued to fall outside, hammering against the windows with relentless fury. But inside the room, there was only silence. The calm before the storm, the breath before the plunge. And as the two of them stepped out into the darkened alley, shadows stretching long and jagged beneath the flickering lights, it was clear that there was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. The rain had not let up. It crashed against the pavement in relentless torrents, flooding the gutters and washing away fragments of city grime. Neon lights bled into pools of water, colors swirling like oil on the surface. Jungkook and Taehyung stood at the edge of the street, hoods pulled low, shadows masking their faces from the occasional passerby. The city hummed around them, oblivious to the storm that brewed in their wake. Jungkook's hand was clenched tightly around the thick folder marked Project K. Files confidential, his knuckles white against the damp leather binding. His eyes flicked nervously from shadow to shadow, reading every movement, every flicker of light with the paranoia of someone who had been hunted before. Taehyung stood beside him, shoulders squared, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He glanced sideways at Jungkook, the rain dripping from his hood in tiny rivulets. "Are you ready?" Taehyung's voice was low, steady, but edged with tension. His eyes searched Jungkook's face, looking for any sign of doubt. Jungkook met his gaze, eyes sharp and unyielding. "We don't have a choice," he replied, voice firm. "If we don't move now, she's gone." His jaw tightened, muscles flexing beneath his skin. And if she's gone, all of this, everything I've done, it's for nothing. Taehyung nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. Where is she? Jungkook pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, unfolding it with shaking hands. The ink was smudged from rain and sweat, but the address was still legible. An old factory, out near the docks. She said she'd be waiting, but she sounded scared. His voice wavered, just for a second, but it was enough for Taehyung to catch. Taehyung placed a hand on Jungkook's shoulder, his grip firm. We're gonna get her, he said, voice steady and unyielding. Whatever it takes. Jungkook exhaled sharply, the tension bleeding from his shoulders for just a moment. I'm holding you to that, he murmured, his eyes flickering with a glimmer of hope. They walked in silence, footsteps splashing through puddles, the roar of the rain drowning out the whispers of the city. The docks loomed ahead, shadowed and industrial, rusted metal and towering containers stretching out into the darkness like a labyrinth of steel and secrets. Fog rolled in thick tendrils around their ankles, snaking between the crates and pooling in shadowed corners. Jungkook stopped, his hand coming up to halt Taehyung. There, he whispered, nodding toward the looming silhouette of the factory. It was massive, its windows shattered and gaping, walls scarred with graffiti and decay. The rain poured off the roof in sheets, pooling around the broken concrete steps that led to a door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Looks inviting, Taehyung muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Any idea what we're walking into? Jungkook's jaw clenched, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. No, he admitted quietly. But I know she's there. She has to be. His fingers flexed around the folder, his knuckles whitening. And if she's not, we're in deeper shit than I thought. Taehyung looked at him, eyes hardening with determination. Then let's not waste time. He stepped forward, the mud and rain splattering up the sides of his boots as he moved. Jungkook followed, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. The door creaked loudly as Taehyung pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a scream. Inside, the darkness was thick and cloying, the scent of mildew and rust heavy in the air. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete floors, bouncing back in hollow whispers that seemed to chase them down the hall. Are you sure this is the right place? Taehyung whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Jungkook nodded, his eyes flickering over the graffiti-streaked walls. She said the East Wing, he replied, voice steady. If she's here, that's where she'll be. Taehyung glanced around, eyes sharp and searching. And if she's not? Jungkook didn't answer. He just kept walking. They moved deeper into the factory, the rain still hammering against the broken windows, shards of glass glittering on the floor like fallen stars. Shadows moved and twisted in the corners, flickering with the dance of distant headlights flashing through the fogged glass. Suddenly a sound, soft, barely there, a whisper of movement. Taehyung's hand shot out, gripping Jungkook's arm. Did you hear that? Jungkook nodded, his eyes wide, breath held tight in his chest. Yeah, he whispered back, voice trembling just slightly. I did. They moved slowly, carefully, slipping between rusted beams and cracked walls. The sound grew louder. Footsteps, light and hurried, splashing through the rainwater pooled on the concrete floor. Minji, Jungkook whispered, his voice breaking the silence like a blade. Minji, is that you? For a moment, there was only silence. And then a whisper, soft and desperate. Jungkook. His heart leapt into his throat. Minji, he shouted, his voice cracking with relief. He surged forward, boots slamming against the wet floor as he rounded the corner. Taehyung followed, eyes sharp, hands ready. She was there, huddled against the wall, her hair matted with rain, eyes wide and frantic. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her thin frame, and her hands shook as she reached out toward him. You came, she whispered, voice trembling. Jungkook fell to his knees beside her, his hands cupping her face, eyes searching hers desperately. Of course I came, he murmured, voice breaking. I promised, didn't I? Minji nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater. I was so scared, she whispered. I thought they found me. Taehyung's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering to the shadows beyond. We have to get out of here, he said, voice firm. Now. Jungkook nodded, helping Minji to her feet. She staggered slightly, her hands gripping his arm tightly. I have it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I have the evidence. Jungkook's eyes widened, his heart hammering in his chest. You found it? He whispered back. Minji nodded, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion lining her features. But they're coming, she continued, voice cracking. They know I have it. We have to move. Taehyung stepped forward, his eyes dark with determination. Then let's go, he said firmly. They moved quickly, slipping through the maze of corridors and rusted stairwells. Minji's hand clutched tightly in Jungkook's. Outside, the rain poured harder than ever, hammering against the steel walls of the factory. And just as they reached the entrance, headlights flared through the fog, casting long shadows that stretched across the wet ground. Engines roared, tires squealing as black SUVs pulled up in a tight line, doors slamming open with military precision. Jungkook's breath caught, his hand tightening around Minji's. They're here, he whispered, voice shaking. Taehyung's eyes blazed with fire. Then we fight. Outside, shadows moved. Dark figures stepped into the rain, their silhouettes sharp and unyielding. Guns glinted under the neon lights, and voices crackled through hidden earpieces. Jungkook met Taehyung's gaze, his expression hardening. We fight, he echoed, voice firm. The rain pounded down, the storm raging with unrelenting fury. But inside the factory, there was only the silence before the storm. And in that silence, Jungkook knew there was no going back. The rain was relentless, pounding against the factory's crumbling walls with the fury of 1,000 storms. Outside, the SUVs idled, their engines rumbling like sleeping beasts waiting to be unleashed. Headlights cut through the fog, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched across the pavement like reaching hands. Jungkook stood just inside the factory entrance, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his hand clutching Minji's tightly. Beside him, Taehyung's eyes were sharp, fists clenched and ready for whatever came next. Minji's hand shook in his grasp, her eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. They're here, she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. We can't stay. We have to move. Jungkook glanced at Taehyung, whose jaw was set in a grim line, eyes blazing with defiance. We're not running, Taehyung said firmly, his voice low and unyielding. Not anymore. Minji's eyes widened, her grip tightening on Jungkook's hand. You don't understand, she whispered fiercely. These people, they don't just stop. If they find us, we're dead. All of us. Jungkook met her gaze, his eyes softening with a flicker of sadness. Then we make sure they don't find us, he replied, voice steady. We have to get out of here, but not like this. Not running. We need to take the fight to them. Taehyung's lips curled into a grim smile. That's what I like to hear, he murmured, his fists flexing at his sides. Minji shook her head, her eyes wild with desperation. You don't know what you're up against, she whispered, voice cracking. They're everywhere. They control everything. We can't just fight them. Jungkook stepped forward, his hands resting on her shoulders, his eyes locking onto hers with a fire that burned with unyielding determination. We can, he said firmly. And we will. He looked back at Taehyung, who nodded, his gaze fierce and unrelenting. But first, we need to get out of here. Taehyung's eyes flickered to the line of black SUVs still idling outside, shadows moving behind tinted windows. They're waiting, he said, voice low and tense. We need a distraction. Minji's eyes snapped back to Jungkook, her hands gripping his sleeves desperately. There's an exit, she whispered, voice barely audible. Back of the factory. Leads out to the waterline. If we're fast, we can get out before they circle around. Jungkook's eyes lit up with determination. Then let's go, he said firmly. He glanced at Taehyung, his expression resolute. You ready? Taehyung grinned, cracking his knuckles. Born ready. They moved quickly, slipping through rusted doorways and broken corridors, the factory's decay crumbling around them. Minji led the way, her footsteps light and swift, barely making a sound against the cracked concrete. Jungkook followed close behind, eyes flicking back and forth, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of shadow that didn't belong. Taehyung brought up the rear, his fists clenched and ready, his breath steady and controlled. They reached the back of the factory, the rain pouring in through shattered windows, pooling in murky puddles that stretched across the floor. The exit loomed ahead, a rusted metal door hanging crookedly on its hinges. Minji paused, turning back to face them. It's just through here, she whispered. But once we're out, they'll know. They'll come after us. Jungkook stepped forward, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting touch of reassurance. Let them come, he murmured, his voice edged with fire. We'll be ready. Minji nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. She pushed the door open, the metal shrieking in protest, and they stepped out into the storm. The rain crashed down harder than ever, soaking them instantly, the wind whipping through the narrow alley like a knife. The water line stretched out before them, the dark surface of the river shimmering with streaks of moonlight. Jungkook turned to Taehyung, his eyes sharp. We need to disappear, he said firmly. Get underground. Find a safe house. We'll regroup there. Taehyung nodded, his eyes flicking back to the factory. You think they'll follow us? Jungkook's jaw clenched. They won't stop, he replied grimly. Not until they have her. Or we're dead. Minji's breath caught, her hands shaking slightly. What are we going to do? She whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jungkook turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment. We're going to fight back, he said quietly. And we're going to win. Suddenly, a shout echoed from the factory, sharp and jagged, cutting through the rain. Flashlights flared in the distance, sweeping through the shadows, casting long, flickering beams of light that sliced through the darkness. Go! Jungkook whispered, his voice tight with urgency. Now! They broke into a run, feet splashing through puddles, breaths coming in sharp bursts as they sprinted along the riverbank. Behind them, voices shouted, flashlights bobbing and weaving, cutting through the rain like daggers of light. Taehyung glanced back, his eyes sharp and unyielding. They're gaining, he shouted over the roar of the rain. Jungkook's jaw clenched. Keep moving, he yelled back. We're almost there. Minji stumbled, her foot catching on a loose stone, and she fell with a cry, her hands scraping against the rough pavement. Jungkook skidded to a halt, spinning back and grabbing her arm, hauling her back to her feet. You're okay, he murmured, his voice fierce and steady. We're almost there. Just a little farther. Minji nodded, her eyes wet with tears and rain, but she kept moving, her steps quickening as she pushed through the pain. They reached the bridge, the iron structure looming above them like a skeleton of steel. The rain poured off it in waterfalls, splashing onto the pavement with violent force. Jungkook led them underneath, ducking into the shadows where the rain didn't reach. He pressed his back against the cold iron, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Taehyung slumped beside him, fists still clenched, eyes sharp. What now? He asked, voice hushed. Jungkook looked out from under the bridge, his eyes scanning the foggy riverbank. We wait, he whispered. And then, we disappear. Minji leaned against the wall, her breath heavy, hands shaking. I can't believe. You actually came, she whispered, voice cracking. Jungkook turned to her, his eyes softening. I promised, he said simply. And I don't break my promises. Minji's eyes shimmered with tears, her lips trembling. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Jungkook reached out, his hand brushing her cheek softly. We're going to get through this, he murmured, his voice filled with unyielding conviction. Together. Taehyung cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the moment. Hate to break this up, he muttered, nodding toward the edge of the bridge where flashlights danced in the distance. But I think our friends found us. Jungkook's eyes darkened, his jaw setting with determination. Then we fight, he said simply. Taehyung grinned, cracking his knuckles. Damn right we do. The rain poured harder, the storm raging with unrelenting fury. Shadows moved in the darkness, creeping closer, the flashlights flickering like fireflies in the fog. But under the bridge, hidden in the shadows, Jungkook, Taehyung, and Minji stood firm, unyielding, unafraid. And as the footsteps grew louder, the flashlights brighter, there was only one truth that remained unspoken between them. The fight was just beginning. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the storm clouds still hung heavy and dark over the city. Mist rolled off the river like smoke, curling and twisting around the steel beams of the bridge where Jungkook, Taehyung, and Minji stood hidden beneath its shadow. The air was thick with tension. Every breath they took sharp and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was weighing down on their lungs. Flashlights flickered in the distance, bobbing up and down like phantom lights in the fog. Shadows stretched long and menacing, creeping closer with every passing second. Jungkook's hands were still gripping Minji's shoulders, steadying her as she caught her breath. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting back and forth between the encroaching lights and the darkness behind them. Taehyung leaned against one of the iron support beams, eyes sharp and unblinking, fists clenched tightly at his sides. His breathing was steady, his gaze locked on the silhouettes moving through the mist. He hadn't said a word since they took cover, his body tensed and ready for whatever came next. Jungkook finally broke the silence, his voice low and steady. They're searching the area, he murmured, eyes flickering over the distant figures. They won't stop until they find us. Taehyung's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with defiance. Then we make sure they don't, he replied firmly. His hands flexed, knuckles cracking in the stillness. How many do you think there are? Jungkook squinted through the fog, tracking the movement of shadows and the quick flicker of lights. 4, maybe 5, he estimated, voice barely above a whisper. But if they called for backup? His voice trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Minji's breathing hitched, her fingers tightening around Jungkook's sleeve. We can't fight them, she whispered, her voice trembling. Not all of them. Taehyung turned to her, his eyes softening just a fraction. We don't need to fight all of them, he said smoothly. Just enough to get out of here. He straightened, brushing the dust from his jacket. I'll draw them off. You two get to the safe house. Jungkook's eyes snapped to his, disbelief flashing across his face. No way, he hissed, voice sharp and unyielding. I'm not leaving you here alone. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a grin. You think I can't handle myself? He teased, voice dripping with mock offense. Jungkook's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing. That's not the point, he growled. We stay together. All three of us. If you go out there alone, I'll be fine. Taehyung interrupted, his voice suddenly serious. He stepped closer, his hands gripping Jungkook's shoulders firmly. Listen to me. If we all try to make a break for it, they'll see us. But if I draw them away, you can get her out. Safely. His eyes flickered to Minji, and then back to Jungkook. That's the priority. We can't lose her. Jungkook's eyes flashed with anguish, his fists clenching so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't like it, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. I don't like leaving you behind. Taehyung's grin returned, wider and more confident than before. I'm not dying here, he replied smoothly. I've got way too much to live for. His hand dropped to his side, fingers brushing the edge of his jacket where a glint of metal shone in the moonlight. Just get her to the safe house. I'll find you. I promise. Minji's eyes shimmered with tears, her hands trembling. You can't, she whispered, her voice breaking. You can't just. Taehyung stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder, his expression softening. I'll be fine, he murmured, his voice gentle. I've been through worse. Just Stay with him, okay? Keep him grounded. He glanced back at Jungkook, his eyes hardening with resolve. I'll give you 5 minutes. After that, you run. Got it. Jungkook hesitated, his eyes flickering with conflict. Taehyung, promise me. Taehyung interrupted, his voice low and commanding. Promise me you'll get her out. Jungkook swallowed hard, his throat tight. I promise, he whispered, voice cracking with emotion. Taehyung grinned, his eyes shining with mischief. Good, he replied. And then, with a sharp breath, he turned and stepped out from under the bridge, his figure disappearing into the mist with a fluid grace that seemed almost unnatural. Jungkook watched him go, his fists clenched, heart hammering in his chest. Minji's hand slipped into his, her grip tight and unyielding. He'll be okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. He has to be. Jungkook didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the shadows, watching as Taehyung's silhouette melted into the fog, the light sweeping toward him like specters in the dark. The shouts came next, sharp, jagged bursts of sound that cut through the mist like knives. Footsteps thundered, flashlights swung wildly, and the crack of something heavy splintered through the silence. Taehyung was fighting. Jungkook's breath came fast and shallow, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wanted to run, to charge back out there and fight alongside him. But Minji's hand held him back, her fingers clinging desperately to his sleeve. Not yet, she whispered, her voice fierce. We have to go. He's counting on us. Jungkook's eyes burned with anguish, but he nodded, his jaw clenching. Let's go, he whispered, his voice cracking with the effort. He pulled her back, away from the shadows, slipping through the dripping iron beams of the bridge and out into the rain-slicked alleys that stretched along the water's edge. Minji moved quickly beside him, her breath ragged but steady. Jungkook led her through twisting corridors and narrow lanes, his footsteps silent, movements fluid and practiced. He knew these streets. He had walked them 1,000 times, mapping every exit, every corner, every shadow that could hide them from sight. Finally, they stopped outside a nondescript metal door set back from the street, hidden behind stacks of rotting wooden crates and rusted metal sheets. Jungkook glanced around, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit before he pushed the door open, the hinges squealing loudly in protest. He pulled Minji inside, slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the room was small and dimly lit by a single naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. Minji slumped against the wall, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. Is this it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Jungkook nodded, his hands bracing on his knees as he caught his breath. For now, he murmured. We regroup. We wait for Taehyung. And then, we move. Minji's eyes shimmered with tears, her hands shaking. You think he'll make it back? She asked, voice cracking with fear. Jungkook's eyes darkened, his jaw setting with determination. He promised, he replied firmly. And Taehyung doesn't break his promises. Minji nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. And if he doesn't? She whispered, voice trembling. Jungkook's gaze hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. Then we burn it all down, he replied, voice dripping with fire. Every last piece of it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, pounding against the windows in a rhythmic, relentless beat. Shadows moved in the distance, flashlights flickering through the mist, searching, hunting. But inside the small, hidden room, Jungkook and Minji waited, breath held, eyes locked on the door, waiting for the shadow that would bring Taehyung back to them, or the one that would signal the beginning of the end. The rain poured mercilessly outside the cracked windows of the safe house, pooling on the uneven concrete and splattering against the rusted metal sheets that formed the outer walls. The room was suffused with a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water leaking from the ceiling, forming tiny puddles that reflected the dim light of the single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb flickered intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls like specters. Jungkook paced restlessly near the door, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes darted to the window every few seconds, the muscles in his jaw tightening with every minute that passed. Minji sat hunched on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at the door. Her hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white from the pressure. "He should be here by now," Jungkook muttered under his breath, his voice edged with frustration and fear. He stopped pacing and turned to look at Minji, his eyes sharp. "Something's wrong. He should have found us by now." Minji glanced up, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Maybe he couldn't get away," she whispered, her voice cracking on the last word. Her fingers twisted together, knuckles whitening as she clutched at her hands. "Maybe they caught him." Jungkook's fists clenched tighter, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. "No," he growled, his voice hardening. "He promised. He's coming back. He has to." His eyes flickered with something raw, something desperate. "I won't believe anything else." Minji swallowed hard, her gaze dropping back to the cracked concrete floor. "But what if?" "Don't," Jungkook snapped, his voice sharp and edged with fire. "Don't even say it. He's coming back." His eyes burned with fierce determination, his fists trembling at his sides. "I won't lose him too." Minji nodded silently, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak again, but her eyes flickered with doubt, the shadows beneath her eyes deepening with every passing second. Outside, the rain continued to fall, pounding against the windows with relentless fury. The wind howled through the narrow alleyways, sending sheets of water spraying against the rusted metal walls of the safe house. Jungkook turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, any flicker of light that might signal Taehyung's return. Minutes stretched into hours, the rain never letting up, the wind howling louder, rattling the windows in their frames. Jungkook's pacing grew more frantic, his eyes wild with desperation. He glanced at his watch, the hands ticking steadily forward, mocking him with their calm predictability. Suddenly, a sound, a faint, distant echo of footsteps splashing through puddles. Jungkook froze, his body going rigid, eyes locked on the door. Minji's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Jungkook didn't answer. He moved silently to the door, pressing his ear against the cold metal, his breath held tight in his lungs. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the splash of water unmistakable. He turned back to Minji, his eyes blazing. "Stay back," he whispered fiercely. Minji nodded, scrambling back against the wall, her eyes wide with fear. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Jungkook reached down, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the pistol he'd hidden beneath his jacket. He pulled it free, the weight of it heavy and familiar in his hands. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Silence stretched thick and heavy, the only sound the rain hammering against the metal roof. Jungkook held his breath, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He glanced back at Minji, whose eyes were locked on the door, her body trembling. A knock. 3 sharp raps against the metal, loud and deliberate. Jungkook's breath hitched, his grip tightening on the pistol. He moved to the side of the door, pressing his back against the wall. "Who is it?" he called out, voice steady and unyielding. A pause. Then, a familiar voice, rough and edged with exhaustion. "It's me," Taehyung rasped, his voice muffled by the rain. "Open the damn door." Jungkook's eyes widened, his hand fumbling for the lock. He yanked the door open, the hinges creaking loudly, and Taehyung stumbled in, rainwater dripping from his hair, his clothes soaked through. His eyes were wild, flickering with adrenaline and something darker, something raw and unguarded. "Shit," Jungkook breathed, his eyes scanning Taehyung's frame. "Are you hurt?" Taehyung shook his head, brushing water from his face. "Not really," he replied, his voice rough. "A few close calls, but I made it." He glanced back at the open door, his eyes sharp. But we don't have long. They're circling. We need to move. Minji scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with fear. Move? Now! She whispered, voice trembling. Taehyung nodded, his expression grim. Now, he repeated firmly. They know we're here. I led them off, but it won't last. We need to get underground. Fast. Jungkook closed the door behind him, locking it tightly. There's an entrance, he murmured, his eyes flicking back to Taehyung. Subway tunnels. Not far from here. If we can get there, we can lose them. Taehyung's eyes lit up with determination. Then let's go, he replied firmly. He glanced at Minji, his expression softening slightly. Can you keep up? Minji nodded, her eyes sharp with resolve. I can, she whispered. I have to. Jungkook moved to the window, his eyes scanning the rain-soaked streets outside. Shadows flickered at the edge of the alley, flashlights bobbing up and down, sweeping through the fog. His eyes narrowed. They're coming, he murmured. We have to go. Now. Taehyung pushed away from the wall, cracking his knuckles. Lead the way, he said smoothly. I've got your back. Jungkook nodded once, his jaw clenched. He turned to Minji, his eyes softening. Stay close to me, he whispered. No matter what happens. Minji swallowed hard, her eyes shining with fear and determination. I will, she promised. They moved quickly, slipping through the back of the safe house and out into the rain. The water splashed up around their ankles as they ran, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the pavement. Flashlights flared behind them, shouts echoing through the fog. Go! Taehyung shouted, his hand shoving Jungkook forward. Don't look back. Jungkook grabbed Minji's hand, pulling her along as they sprinted through the narrow alleyways, ducking between rusted fences and broken-down cars. The rain poured harder, masking their footsteps, the sound of pursuit fading behind them. They reached the entrance to the subway tunnel, the iron gate hanging crookedly on its hinges. Jungkook yanked it open, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Get inside, he ordered, voice sharp. Minji slipped through, followed closely by Taehyung. Jungkook was the last to enter, slamming the gate shut behind him. He turned back, breathless, eyes wild with adrenaline. Taehyung grinned, wiping rain from his eyes. Well, he murmured, his voice softening with relief. That was fun. Jungkook shot him a look, but his eyes gleamed with something brighter, hope. We're not done yet, he replied, voice firm. Taehyung clapped him on the back, his grin widening. Good, he replied, because I'm just getting started. And as they slipped deeper into the shadows of the subway, the world above them raged on, oblivious to the war brewing just beneath its surface.